Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Allbyon by Brandy Pearson. This is part 2 of The Tale of the Forest, so do go back and listen to the first part if you haven't. In it, the witch, Jane Morris, who travels around the forest every year, has been hearing tales and has even seen some strange beasts. She saw a worm herself. She sent out a dream message to see if someone could come and help her, because she sensed something dark and something odd in the forest, and now a man has turned up. Let's see what he's got to say to himself. For himself. Anywho. Jane left the cottage and followed the girl. Standing in the village square was a tall man in a fine dark blue velvet coat with shiny silver buttons, looking around. He held the reins of a tall black horse with fine leather tack. She did not need any special senses to realise he was a wizard. She was a little taken aback that a wizard received her dream message. "Mistress Jane Morris, my name is Claudius Merrick. I'm a wizard and tutor at the Academy of High Magic in the City of the White Tower. I have come in response to your dream message." "Oh, I never believed a wizard would understand my dream message, even if a wizard dreamed it. I certainly did not believe a wizard would come. I'm sorry, you must think I'm so rude. I'm so pleased to meet you." She took his hand and shook it vigorously. Then a thought came to her. "I don't know how much of the message you received. Danger in the forest? Someone saw a worm? Oh, I'm relieved the message came through so clearly. And do you believe me? One of my tasks at the wizard school is to look about. I am a tutor in far viewing. It's one of my skills. Your dream came to me and seemed to bring with it a sense of something dark and strange." "From me?" "Oh no, not from you, but from what is around you, from this forest." "Have you ever worked with a witch before?" she asked guardedly. He laughed. "No, Mistress Morris, but I feel that you have never worked with a wizard either, so it will be a new experience for us both." He bowed to her, smiling, which made her laugh. "That's true. I saw a worm myself, after I sent the dream message, 3 days ago now, off in the distance, and a darkness and some other creature I could not see in the trees beside me that warned me off, told me not to go on. I think this forest may well need a witch and a wizard working together. It's late in the day, so might I suggest that tomorrow we go into the forest ourselves and try to discover what is going on." Later, after the wizard had made sure his horse was well looked after, and Jane Morris had visited a couple who she was caring for, they sat down together at supper in the small inn. Then Jane had the chance to ask the wizard the questions she had been asked in the inn at Ashington. "Are worms just creatures of old tales, and were never real? Were they real but died out many years ago? And how has a worm, not to mention the flying creature and the giant spiders and a giant ogre, come to be in Oakbourne Forest here and now?" "I believe there were worms, as there are still sea serpents, but there have been no reports of them for many generations. As for giant spiders, I once had a long discussion with a wizard who seemed to know all that there was to know about about spiders, and he thought that they could never grow so very big. They don't have bones inside, so they would be squashed if they got more than a few inches high. Gross. But people have seen them. I met a whole family who were so certain they had seen some that they were moving away from the village they had lived in for many generations." Said the wizard. "None of us want to look like fools, and a little scepticism is healthy, but sometimes that can tempt us to disbelieve what is true because it does not fit our previous assumptions. Some wizards spend a great deal of time considering what is true and what is not. A few spend their time trying to justify their own beliefs when they are not true. We need to find out more." He shrugged. "I've never felt the need to think about such things," Jane replied, "until now. My life is usually full of trampling roads and broken legs and ailing babies and cows and the like. It's important that I know what my herbs truly are and what my spells truly do. Indeed, we do need to find out more." And so the next morning, after a hearty breakfast, Mistress Jane and Wizard Claudius set off into the forest along the path to the river. She reflected that they must have made a strange pair. She only reached up to his shoulder, and was quite broad, despite all the walking, and was wearing a faded green woolen coat over a red and black skirt and a sturdy old brown leather ankle boots. He was tall and thin, despite all the sitting about reading books, and wearing his blue velvet coat with the silver buttons and knee-length shiny black boots. She wondered if he polished them every morning. She had an iron-shod stick with a leather strap, and he was carrying a black ebony cane with silver top in the shape of a lion's head. Suddenly, as before, Jane Morris caught sight of something moving out of the corner of her eye and heard a rustling. "Look," she said to the wizard, but he missed it. Then the voice, "Do not go on." Last time, I whispered that, and then I read this. Last time it was a whisper, this time almost a shout. She stopped in the middle of the path, but the wizard walked on. "Did you not hear that?" she asked. "A voice. What did it say?" The wizard drew a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and a sort of writing stick that Jane did not recognise. It said, "Do not go on." The wizard wrote in the notebook. "Did you not hear it? It said the same as last time, but was much louder." "I heard nothing. Do you want to continue?" he asked. "Indeed I do," she replied. She felt rattled, but was not going to admit it to a wizard. They had only walked a few yards further when one of the villagers appeared on the path ahead, running so fast towards them that he cannoned into them and almost knocked them down. "Mistress Jane! Sir! Oh my, I'm so sorry! I was being chased by a flying beast, like a lion with wings, or an eagle with 4 legs. He looked around wildly. "Oh, it's gone. Maybe it saw you and was frightened away. I thought it would carry me away in its claws." "What were you doing in the forest?" asked the wizard crossly. "I needed some clay. I'm a potter. The best blue clay is along down by the river. I can't make pots without it. What will I do? There's nowhere so good nearby." Jane patted his arm. "It's Edmund, isn't it? Calm down, my dear. You get off home and make yourself a cup of chamomile tea, or a beaker of ale. The wizard and I are doing our best to find out what's going on." A little calmer, Edmund the potter continued on up the path to the village, and the wizard noted down what had happened in the notebook. Then Mistress Jane, the witch, and the wizard Claudius Merrick, carried on down the path. Then Jane realised that it was beginning to grow dark. The wizard looked up. "The trees are no taller. This is not a natural darkness." He noted it down in his book, then stared ahead. "This is some kind of magical darkness. There is something wrong here." "I feel a prickling in the back of my throat which comes to the same conclusion," said Jane. The wizard noted this down too. As he looked up, they both saw it. Far off between the trees, a great glittering slithering, the flank of a huge worm. "We both saw that, didn't we?" she said. "The side of a great worm which should not be here," said the wizard. "Do we go on?" "Do not go on!" a voice cried, but again the wizard did not hear it when Jane told him, who wrote it all down in his notebook. "If we don't carry on, we won't learn any more," said the witch firmly. "Maybe we would be safer if we could not be seen," said the wizard. "Well, I think I'm too broad and you're too tall for hiding in the trees," said Jane. "I have a simpler solution, an invisibility spell," said the wizard. "I have one in the back of my book. I've never been invisible. Might be an idea if there are great monstrous beasts around. I keep some of the most useful complex spells in this little book, the ones I can't quite commit to heart. I can't carry around my book of spells, it's too heavy." He looked up the spell and started to speak it. Jane was fascinated. Her spells were more like little songs, her hand gestures like waving or dancing. The wizard's spell reminded her of a priest at his liturgy, very precise words and gestures. As the spell formed, she could feel it flowing over her. When she could no longer see the wizard, she realised that she too was invisible. "I don't wish to be forward, Mistress Morris, but I think we need to hold hands if we are to carry on together. We do not want to get separated." For Jane, being invisible was scarcely odder than walking along holding hands with the wizard. They continued on down the path in the gathering gloom as the prickling in the back of her throat grew stronger. There was also something else that she felt was missing, but but she could not put her finger on it. They reached the place where they had seen the worm slither past. On either side trees were bent and broken. The course the worm had taken was clear. Jane felt strangely disappointed, and for a moment could not work out why. "Wait a second," she whispered. "Let me think. I think I was expected that when we got here there would be no sign of the worm. Now why was that? Don't worry, I was asking myself the question, not you, because when we saw the worm, what we saw was exactly the same as what I saw before. I think that I thought it might be a glamour, an illusion, but it isn't." "I have to let go of your hand," the wizard whispered back. "I need to write it in my notebook, even if I can't actually see it." "Just don't go anywhere." The notes written, presumably, they carried on down the path. They could hear the river now, and soon came to the place where the potter had been digging for clay. His shovel lay by the path where he had dropped it. Suddenly they heard the beating of great wings. They both stood stock still and witnessed a great flying beast swoop down. It had been a good plan to become invisible, because it flew right past them and on up the path. After it had gone, the wizard said, "That seemed to be exactly as the potter described, but I felt it brush the top of my head as it passed. It was no glamour either." "Let us go further and see what we can find," said Jane. Becoming invisible was indeed a good idea. They carried along the path that was now following the course of the river. It grew even darker. After a while, after a whispered conversation, Wizard Claudius formed a small ball of light to bob along in front of them. It looked like a firefly, so they hoped no one would notice it. It provided just enough light for them to see where they were going. They walked for a long time. It was difficult to know how long. It must have been the middle of the day, but it was as dark as night. Jane had never been this far into the forest, and soon the path disappeared. They continued on by the river so that they might not get lost. Mistress Jane realized that it must be the middle of the day because she was getting hungry. However, her appetite was forgotten when they came through a stand of trees into a clearing. It should have been bright sunshine, but the darkness was so thick it seemed like soup. The wizard's little ball of light had just enough power to show them that in the middle of the clearing rose up a tall tower of black stone. A single light shone from a window high above. Suddenly a shadow fell across it, and the witch and wizard both froze. A face looked out. The prickling in the back of Jane's throat grew so strong it almost choked her. Wizard Claudius urgently pulled her away, back into the trees. They stumbled quite a way before the wizard stopped. "I know what is happening," he whispered. "I felt it when he looked out of the window. He is mad, his mind is scrambled, but he is a powerful wizard. His madness is creating those monstrous creatures." "What are you going to do?" Jane hissed. "We need to get out of here, and I must return to the academy and consult with the others." They turned to retrace their steps back towards the village, but were faced with yet more monsters. Coming down from the trees were half a dozen giant spiders. They may have been impossible, but they were terrifying as they chittered and spun their thick, sticky webs. They seemed to be deliberately spinning a curtain of threads to prevent the witch and wizard from leaving the dark forest. The wizard pulled Jane back to avoid the webs. They turned back, but more spiders appeared, and they were in danger of being surrounded, which was the moment the witch Jane and Wizard Claudius lost their grip on one another. Jane whirled around, reaching out, but there was a great knot developing in the webbing. "Get out!" the wizard shouted. "I'm caught!" There was one gap in the webs, and Jane dived through it and found herself running back towards the tower. As she ran, she did her best to calm herself down and think. An idea came, which almost threw her back into a panic, but it was her only idea, so on she ran. She reached the door at the foot of the tower, but it was locked. She stood, getting her breath back and trying to think what to do, and remembered an unlocking spell. It was not anything she used often, but had kept it in mind in case of the need to get through a door when someone was ill on the other side. After a deep breath, She sang the spell and heard a satisfying click and the sound of a bolt being drawn back. She entered as quietly as she could, and just in time, as there was a roaring and a tramping, and she caught sight of an enormous ogre stomping all around the tower. All the noise was outside. The tower was eerily quiet and even darker. She managed to find the stairs and started up them as quickly but quietly as she could. She toiled up several floors. There was a little light now, coming through a crack in the door at the top of the stairs. She squeezed through into the room and saw the wizard, hoping desperately that he could not see through the invisibility spell or sense her in any other way. What she saw terrified her. A wizard was standing by the window opposite. His hair was dishevelled, and his robes, though of good quality, were grubby and torn. Before him on a lectern there was a great book. He was rifling through the pages, muttering to himself. From time to time he waved his hands around before his face as if brushing flies away. Jane first thought the gestures must be part of a spell, but then she heard him cry out, "Leave me be! Begone, foul demon!" At this point Jane realised the weakness of her plan. Her idea was to sing a sleeping spell, but as soon as she started to sing he would know that she was there. But there was no choice. The spell was in her voice. She began to sing quietly, circling around the room. The wizard whirled around trying to find her. "Who is that? Demon, show yourself!" She felt a spell, maybe a revealing spell, but it was scrambled by the madness within the wizard. She looked into his eyes. There was great power there, but a brokenness, like looking through a cracked glass window. As she sang, moving all the time, he called out. She could see now that he was in great pain. She had sung her sleeping spell for people in great pain before, sometimes for people who were dying. Somewhere inside the mad wizard he was desperate for sleep. She sang more and more clearly, projecting the spell at him as strongly as she could. Still looking into his eyes, she could see the spell take hold. He stopped, looked for her, stopped wildly waving his hands about. Eventually he sagged to his knees, and she realised that it was growing lighter. The darkness outside was fading, and daylight was reasserting itself. She realised it had grown quiet outside. The ogre had gone. The wizard slumped down on the floor and was now fast asleep. The prickling in the back of her throat had subsided. She sang a final verse of her spell to keep him sleeping, the strongest version of her spell that she would usually only use on someone who was dying. She now went up to him. He was breathing deeply and regularly. She found a cushion and put it under his head. Now that his face was relaxed, she could see how ravaged it was. "You have been so frightened for so long, and none of your monsters made you feel any better." She stroked his head, smoothing down his tangled hair. She hoped that Wizard Claudius was safe, but she could not leave. Much of her calling as a witch was in healing, and here was someone in great need of it. What was going to happen to him? Would he have to sleep forever? After a while she heard Wizard Claudius calling her name from outside. She shouted down to him to come up. Her hand reappeared, as he must have undone his invisibility spell as he climbed the stairs. When he came into the room, she saw he had mud on his blue velvet coat and twigs in his hair, and one of his silver buttons was missing. Jane explained what she had done, and he looked at her with admiration. He told her what had happened to him. As the light had returned, the spiders had disappeared along with their sticky threads. He had been drawn up by the spiders into the tree, but luckily managed to take hold of a branch and climb down. He bowed to her. "I will never underestimate the power of a witch again, Mistress Jane," he said. "Well, thank you for the compliment, Master Claudius, but I have no idea what to do now. He will sleep for many hours, and I can sing the spell again, but that does not seem to solve the problem." Claudius squatted down next to the sleeping wizard and looked at him carefully. "Oh my, I recognise him. We trained together at the academy. I hope I don't look as old as he does. His madness has drained life from him. He has lived his life in terror and sent it out into the forest. I can keep him asleep, but sleeping too long is not good for a body. Another solution must be found, but firstly we have to get him back to the village." Wizard Claudius carried him down the stairs and out into what was now a brightly lit forest clearing. The sleeping wizard was not heavy, he had not been eating properly, and was very thin. As Mistress Jane stepped out onto the grass she heard a voice and saw rustling in the trees. Was there a monster still enduring? "You have driven the darkness away," said the rustling voice. "Did you hear that?" she said to the wizard. "I heard nothing," he replied. "Are you one of the sleeping wizard's creatures?" she said out into the trees. "No," cried the voice, sounding offended. "We tried to warn you, tried to keep you away from danger." "I'm sorry, I misunderstood. My name is Jane Morris. I'm a witch. Who are you?" There was a rustling that Jane recognised was laughter. "We know you're a witch. That's why we warned you. We care for witches who come into the trees." "Would you show yourself to me?" she said curiously. There was more rustling, maybe a conversation, and then from out of the trees came several figures, in the form of a human being, but covered in leaves. Wizard Claudius looked up, but could see no one. "We are green men," said the leafy people. Jane curtsied to them. "Might you show yourself to my friend?" she asked cautiously. "If he is your friend, we will." The green men rustled, and the wizard gasped. He stood up straight and bowed to them. "They tried to warn us to keep us safe," Jane said to him. "Green men, could you help us get this sleeping man back to the village?" "If it rids this forest of him, yes, indeed we will. We will carry him to the edge of the trees." Okay, and that is the end of part 2. Join me again to see how this all ends up.